As an addendum to my previous post, let's talk about motive and trying to assert and assess the motive of government. Okay, if I allege, which I am not 100% alleging, that the government created storms in Florida that are causing hurricanes, if I allege that, let's say I 100% was all in for that, and I said, dude, the government is doing this. They have HARP, they have the patent that I showed you, yada yada. You could be a little jackass and be like, Lils, uh, this patent is insufficient to prove. Why would they do that? What would be the reasoning for doing that? Dude, don't even try to dip a toe into the reasoning as to why a government that you've given that much power does what they do. In being very strongly for the argument that 9/11 was an inside job, I've heard a million arguments against. Okay, I wrote a book about it, so I had to vet that book and make sure that every detail was true. So I faced a lot of arguments online and otherwise about it. And one of the major arguments is like, if the government wanted to invade Iraq and Afghanistan, why wouldn't they just do that instead of going to the trouble of blowing up buildings and killing citizens and hijacking planes? And I'm like, because it's a Masonic ritual. And they're like, oh, okay, oh, sure, buddy. They're fucking idiots. I wish they were in the World Trade Center on September 11th. So let's talk about the Challenger explosion. If you're Generation X or older, you most definitely remember the Challenger explosion, which happened on January 28th, 1986. If you're younger than that, you should know that it happened, but you probably don't understand that similar to the JFK assassination, it was central to news media and to everything that everybody believed for that like month or whatever. Again, I was like a little kid at that time, but if I sat up and I said, I think that secret government did this, they faked it. And they faked it because they want to divert from other things that are happening. Diversion, as I explained. Everybody would say, what the hell is this child talking about? He is insane. Put him in a special program for, with a short bus. But I believe that is exactly what happened, and I will attempt to prove it to you right now. Millions watched the Challenger launch. Krista McAuliffe was a school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire. McAuliffe was chosen from 11,000 applicants to the NASA Teacher in Space project and was scheduled to become the first teacher to fly in space. In fact, then Vice President George H.W. Bush, Freemason and Skull and Bones member, handpicked McAuliffe in a press conference. Because of this, teachers across the country rolled TVs into their classrooms to watch the history-shaping event. I promise you, because I was alive in the 80s, I promise you not a single one of those teachers, none of them knew that Bush was a Skull and Bones member, a Freemason, visited Bohemian Grove, did mock sacrifices in the woods of Northern California. None of that. They probably didn't know what a Freemason was. If they did, they had a very vague impression of what it was, and they certainly couldn't have anticipated 9/11 since nobody came out and said, hey, Freemasons are going to do this ritual inaugurating the Age of Aquarius on September 11th, 2001. My own parents both had top secret clearances and both worked on black projects. And they didn't know. And they took some time to be convinced that 9/11 was done by the government, but they both accepted it. My dad died recently, and he accepted it the last time I talked to him. And my mom accepts it too. So suck on that. If anybody ever says to you, nobody who ever worked in the government with a high clearance would think such a thing, or wouldn't somebody who was in that position come out and say that they believed that 9/11 was an inside job? Well, my mom is one. She was personal friends with admirals and other people who would come over to our house, okay? So in this way, the majority of Americans' eyes were focused on the Challenger launch. But 73 seconds after Challenger's launch, that dream quickly became a nightmare. Challenger evaporated as white vapor emitted from the external tank. Spectators looked on shocked. Teachers scrambled to get their kids out to recess. Images of the Y-shaped explosion dominated the news cycle for days. Most people seem to remember about the explosion that for this launch, Every school seemed to be watching it live. Now, keep in mind, they did a search for a teacher to send into space, and that search was spearheaded by George H.W. Bush, an ex CIA director. All the classes had the big TVs rolled in. That didn't happen with other space launches, okay? Faulty O rings were blamed for the explosion. In every classroom in America, the video was replayed and many tears were shed. The remains of the crew members were only recovered in the cabin in the Atlantic Ocean, among other debris, in March of 1986, more than a month after the tragedy. All evidence of the reality of what happened to them had been thoroughly washed away. In other words, unlike Apollo 1, which exploded, the actual evidence regarding the case wasn't found till much later. Every study about their deaths since has then proven to be unsubstantial. There's no available evidence of the bodies, believe it or not. There's no Social Security death index for all 7 Challenger crew members. What are the odds? As far as Social Security is concerned, Francis Richard Scobie, Michael J. Smith, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, Greg Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe were still alive. So what happened? Turns out each member has an analog out there that's very much alive. Krista McAuliffe's full name is Sharon Krista McAuliffe. In 2013, as recently as that, a person named Sharon McAuliffe, a Syracuse University of Law professor, was found. Sharon McAuliffe was the same age as the supposedly dead astronaut would have been in 2013. It may also be entirely coincidental that Sharon was a cousin of Terry McAuliffe, the current governor of Virginia, who was a co-chairman of President Bill Clinton's 1996 re-election campaign and was chairman of Hillary Clinton's 2008 presidential campaign. The Challenger commander, Richard Scobie, had an analog who is now the CEO of a Chicago advertising firm named Cows in Trees. Many noted how the logo of his company bore a striking similarity to the famous image of the Challenger explosion. Both crew members Ronald McNair and Ellison Onizuka were found to have identical twins. What's the odds of that? Carl McNair and Claude Onizuka, who are still living today. But ancestry searches were done for both Carl McNair and Claude Onizuka. No birth history came up for either man. Again, what are the odds of all these things happening? The odds of being a twin are less than 3 in 100. And the odds that 2 people were in one space shuttle mission, already a rigorous selection, are very remote. Yet the 2 twin brothers of the people that allegedly died in the Challenger explosion worked together on science and engineering projects. That is odd, isn't it? Wouldn't you want to forget about that incident? Would you pal up and buddy up and work with somebody who happened to be your twin brother's co-astronaut? Michael J. Smith was an engineer who served as the Challenger's pilot, a man with the same name who was identical in appearance to Smith, adding 30 years, was 69 years old, the same age that Michael J. Smith would have been had he survived the crash. Once again, same age, same face, same name, and he too was a professor. Smith taught industrial engineering, the same field as Michael J. Smith, at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. A YouTuber approached this Michael Smith, who denied the claims. Many looks at the ground and attempts at diverting from the subject ensue. He kind of has the demeanor of someone in the witness protection program, which I'll get to in a second. What one has to accept about space missions and the like is that everyone involved is a Department of Defense employee. This is worth repeating. If you are an employee of the Department of Defense, you do what the Department of Defense tells you to do. You do not get your own say for threat of going to Leavenworth, Kansas in a prison they have for people who defy their secret clearances, etc. I got that same threat. Both my parents got that same threat. That's what you get if you're a Department of Defense employee. You are not a private sector worker who gets to say whatever you want. You don't have free speech anymore. Okay, you are a government employee. You do as the government says. You sign away your right to all those things to ever speak of it ever again, the same way as when you're in the witness protection program. When the heat started to get turned up on the whole affair, We got, of course, the old diversion tactic, a New York Post article that describes that the crew of the Challenger survived the explosion, with the conclusion that they all died in the ocean crash, though. So the New York Post article says Challenger crew likely survived explosion before tragic plunge to Earth. And that article came out in the New York Post June 19th, 2021. Can you think of anything that was happening at that time that might have buried the lead and made the story unimportant? This tactic is used so that when people Google Challenger crew survived, they get this article at the top of the search, and most people will dismiss any further investigation and leave it at that. This is sufficient for many rubes out there. But why? Why would they do this? Well, first of all, it's worth noting that the Challenger space shuttle had escape hatches. So you could watch the astronauts go into the space shuttle, and they could have used the escape hatches to leave immediately after. They might have signed an agreement to do so. I'll give you two reasons why the Challenger space shuttle explosion might have been fake. On December 12th, 1985, just a month before the Challenger explosion, a U.S. military plane crashed 19 seconds after takeoff from Gander International Airfield in Newfoundland, Canada. All 256 people on board died, 8 crew members and 248 members of the Army's 101st Airborne Division, making it the worst air disaster in U.S. military history. Many people believe, for many reasons, that the Gander crash was orchestrated by the government. Unsolved Mysteries did an episode on it. In that episode, Harvey Day, a rescue worker at the crash site, says he saw 5 wooden boxes and was turned away from the area by military men. The boxes are largely supposed to have contained missiles and ammunition that may have been part of a top-secret weapons trade, a popular thing at that time. Quote, I have absolutely no doubt I can categorically say I believe there was an attempt to cover up what happened, end quote, said Representative Robin Talon, Democrat from South Carolina, of his attempts to find answers in the Gander crash probe. Some facts about the Gander crash are a bright flash was witnessed by multiple people before the crash. Mysterious casket-shaped boxes were loaded onto the plane, the contents of which remain unknown to this day. High levels of carbon monoxide were found in the lungs of flight passengers. Where did this poisonous gas come from? Most importantly, if the passengers had died instantaneously in a crash, as was reported, how did they breathe this gas into their lungs? A dead person is obviously unable to inhale air. The crash scene left over 30 rescue workers with symptoms of radiation poisoning, which is what would happen if there were advanced weapons on board. The soldiers on the flight were returning to the U.S. from a 6-month peacekeeping mission in the Middle East. The exact nature of their mission, however, was secretive, and many people questioned what they were truly up to during the deployment. The debris of the Gander crash was quickly buried in a dump instead of reassembled to study the crash, as what would be done in a normal case, and the U.S. government sealed the crash records for 70 years. Unlike the Challenger, right? In the months after the crash, as one strange detail after another emerged, the Gander crash received a lot of media coverage. To reiterate, this was the worst air disaster in the history of the U.S. military, and it was starting to look like it wasn't an accident. Simultaneously, most have heard the late 1980s Iran-Contra scandal, but few today are aware of how massive the scandal was. In a nutshell, members of the U.S. government were caught illegally selling weapons to Iran in exchange for U.S. hostages being held there. We're not talking knives and handguns either. They were selling missiles and rocket launchers for millions of dollars. This U.S. group then used the money they made from the weapons sales to train and equip a group in Nicaragua, the Contras, who were engaged in civil war trying to overthrow the government. But the real controversy of Iran-Contra was that it exposed a shadowy group of federal agents, military personnel, and politicians who oversaw Iran-Contra. This group was branded the Enterprise. It sounds like science fiction. The general public, almost all of Washington, D.C., and even a majority of the world had no idea this secret group even existed. Everything that was going on during Iran-Contra, the missile sales, the training, funding of rebel armies who killed hundreds, it was all being done in secret by the Enterprise without telling Congress or anyone else in the government. That is extremely illegal, and because it happened under Reagan, that makes Reagan a war criminal. So they tossed the entire thing onto one guy's head, Oliver North, so that they could use him as a scapegoat. The Challenger mission, it should be noted, was essentially a military operation. 4 members of the Challenger crew were from the military, and 2 were from major military contractors. Every major member of NASA's leadership comes from the military. Were these military personnel simply ordered to take one for the team and participate in a hoax that would distract from the situation of the Gander crash that could lead to some really powerful people getting in some really hot water? If so, it worked. The Gander became an afterthought when the Challenger explosion and investigation drenched the headlines for months. The public pressure that was starting to mount for answers in the Gander crash all but fizzled out. Ask anyone about the Gander crash who's older, and few recall it. Ask them about the Challenger, and everyone remembers it. Challenger crew family members belong to a board of a nonprofit foundation that rakes in nearly $5 million per year from donations. The whole formula is very alike to the Sandy Hook shootings, which also have a nonprofit Sandy Hook Promise that rakes in millions of dollars. It's long been rumored that many foundations aren't really foundations at all, just fronts for money laundering. In other words, suppose the people from Sandy Hook are Witness Protection Program members. The government orders them to participate in Sandy Hook Promise. The government then takes the money from Sandy Hook Promise and funnels that into black projects. Okay, that's how convoluted things actually work. Smooth brain. These foundations provide means to discreetly pay people for participating in cover-ups. Instead of paying someone directly, which has to be reported and explained to the IRS and to watchdogs, one can simply discreetly hide the payment as a donation to a foundation and pay off participants in this way. The wording foundation and charity is a suspect note to begin with. If the goal of Sandy Hook Promise was to get legislation written so that guns are taken out of the situation, that legislation was already written in their state legislature, so why are they still accepting money? Remember, the Challenger explosion happened long before the internet, back when it was nearly impossible for a citizen to research and find information on others. The tactics of making someone disappear were much different. Maybe it was simply easier to have the astronauts escape from the hatch before the launch, disappear after the explosion for a year or two, resurface later in new cities and begin new lives, as opposed to giving them new identities and getting many other people involved, and law enforcement as well. Law enforcement would not have the same obligation to the government. Important distinction. So, in other words, if they were put in a witness protection program, there'd be cops involved, and those cops could speak or write a book or whatever afterwards. But if it's all government employees, no one can. Do you understand? NASA is a government organization. NASA is not afraid to lie. That is thoroughly documented. Perhaps the government uses this agency for covert purposes that the general public, not being on a need-to-know basis, will never fully comprehend. Keep that in mind when you watch videos of stunned public viewing the incident. It's a lot like the JFK assassination, where people are just crestfallen and heartbroken that the president would be killed by a crazy communist. Interesting that an ex-CIA agent would suddenly turn into a communist when the president needs to be murdered. 20 million people watched the Challenger explode as it launched. What other massive lies that impact so many people's perception can be commonly perceived incorrectly?